I was arranging fresh tulips in the kitchen vase when my youngest daughter Emma walked in, phone pressed to her ear, laughing at something her friend had said. She glanced at me and rolled her eyes before speaking loud enough for me to hear every word. "Yeah, Mom's going on another one of her dates tonight. Can you believe it? She's 53 and still thinks someone's going to want her. It's honestly embarrassing." The laughter from the other end of the phone echoed through the kitchen as Emma continued, "I mean, who's going to date a divorced mom with 3 kids? She needs to accept reality and focus on being a grandmother someday instead of chasing fairy tales." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I stood there holding a yellow tulip, my hand trembling slightly as her words hit me like ice water. This wasn't the first time I'd heard comments like this from my children, but something about the casual cruelty in Emma's voice, the way she spoke about me like I was a pathetic joke, made my chest tighten with a pain I couldn't quite name. I set the flower down carefully and walked out of the room without saying a word, my heart pounding with a mixture of hurt and something else, something that felt dangerously close to determination. My name is Lois Campbell, and at 53, I had somehow become the family's cautionary tale. Not intentionally, mind you, but through a series of quiet compromises and well-meaning sacrifices that had slowly erased the woman I used to be. I lived in the same colonial house in Maplewood, where I'd raised my 3 children alone after their father left us when Emma was just 6. The house had good bones, as real estate agents like to say, but it also held the weight of 20 years of single motherhood, of birthday parties I'd planned alone, of parent-teacher conferences where I'd sat in chairs meant for 2, of Christmas mornings where I'd been both the giver and the one making sure everyone felt loved. My children were now 25, 22, and 19. Marcus, my eldest, worked in finance and lived in a downtown apartment that cost more than my monthly mortgage. He visited exactly twice a month, usually when he needed something, and had perfected the art of making me feel grateful for his brief appearances. Sarah, my middle child, was finishing her master's degree in psychology, which she used primarily to analyze everything wrong with my life choices. And Emma, my baby, was a sophomore at the state university, who came home every weekend with laundry and opinions about how I should be living. The irony wasn't lost on me that I had raised 3 intelligent, successful young adults who somehow couldn't see their mother as anything more than a relic from their childhood. To them, I was Lois the caretaker, Lois the provider, Lois the woman who had sacrificed her youth so they could have everything they needed. But Lois the woman, Lois with desires and dreams and the audacity to think she deserved love? That version of me was apparently too ridiculous to take seriously. I had been divorced for 15 years, and for most of that time, dating had been the furthest thing from my mind. There were soccer games to attend, homework to supervise, college funds to build. I worked as a marketing coordinator for a small nonprofit, a job that paid enough to keep us comfortable, but never quite enough to feel secure. My days blended together in a rhythm of responsibility and routine, and I told myself I was content. I told myself that fulfillment came from watching my children grow, from being needed, from being the steady foundation they could always count on. But somewhere around my 50th birthday, something had shifted. Maybe it was watching Emma pack for college, or seeing the house grow quiet for the first time in decades, or simply waking up one morning and realizing that I had spent so long being someone's mother that I'd forgotten how to be myself. I started small, joining a book club at the local library, taking a watercolor class at the community center, buying clothes that I liked instead of clothes that were practical. And eventually, tentatively, I started dating. It wasn't anything dramatic at first. Coffee dates with divorced dads from work, dinner with a man I'd met at the grocery store who'd helped me reach something on a high shelf. Nothing serious. Nothing that threatened the careful balance I'd maintained for so long. But my children reacted as if I'd announced I was joining the circus. The eye rolls, the whispered conversations that stopped when I entered a room, the way they suddenly became very interested in my schedule and whereabouts. They treated my dating life like an embarrassing phase, one needed to outgrow, like a midlife crisis that would surely pass if they just ignored it long enough. The house on Elmwood Street had been my sanctuary for 2 decades, but lately it felt more like a museum of my former life. Family photos lined the hallways, tracking the progression from young mother with 3 small children to empty nester whose children came home primarily to remind her of her limitations. The living room still held the same furniture I'd bought when Marcus was in elementary school, sturdy pieces chosen for their ability to withstand spilled juice and jumping children rather than their aesthetic appeal. My bedroom, the one space that should have been entirely mine, was filled with practical things. A sensible queen bed with a beige comforter, a dresser topped with framed photos of my children's graduations, a nightstand that held reading glasses and hand cream rather than anything that hinted at romance or passion. I had become invisible in my own life, and the strangest part was that I had done it voluntarily. Every decision I'd made for the past 20 years had been filtered through the lens of what was best for my children, what would make them happy, what would give them the opportunities I'd never had. I'd convinced myself that this was what good mothers did, that sacrifice was love, that my own desires were selfish indulgences that could wait until someday, when the children were grown and settled and no longer needed me. But someday had arrived, and my children weren't celebrating my newfound freedom. Instead, they seemed determined to keep me locked in the role I'd always played, the devoted mother whose life revolved entirely around theirs. They called it concern, but it felt more like control. They said they wanted me to be happy, but only if that happiness looked exactly like what they thought it should look like: quiet, contained, and entirely focused on being available for their needs. The morning after Emma's phone conversation, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold while I stared out the window at the neighbor's garden. Mrs. Patterson, who was 78, was out there planting new roses, her movements careful but determined. She'd been a widow for 10 years, and just last month she'd started dating a gentleman from her church choir. Her children lived across the country and called her twice a week to check in, but they trusted her to live her own life. I envied her that trust, that freedom to make choices, without a panel of adult children weighing in on every decision. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Mom, Emma told me about your date tonight. Don't you think you're moving a little fast with this whole dating thing? Maybe you should focus on yourself for a while, instead of looking for validation from men." I stared at the message for a long time, trying to understand when wanting companionship had become seeking validation, when hoping for love had become moving too fast. I typed and deleted several responses before finally putting the phone down without answering at all. The truth was, I wasn't moving fast at all. I was moving carefully, tentatively, like someone learning to walk again after a long illness. Every date felt like a small act of rebellion against the version of myself I'd accepted for so long. I wasn't looking for someone to complete me or validate me. I was looking for someone who might see me as more than just a collection of roles and responsibilities. I wanted to feel like Lois again, not just mom or the divorced lady next door, or the woman who organized the office holiday party every year. But my children's disapproval was wearing me down. It crept into every interaction, every conversation, every moment when I should have felt free to make my own choices. They had perfected the art of making me feel selfish for wanting anything beyond their approval, and I was starting to believe them. Maybe I was too old, maybe I was being ridiculous, maybe I should just accept that my romantic life was over and focus on being the kind of mother and eventual grandmother they wanted me to be. That evening, as I got ready for dinner with David, a gentleman I'd met through the book club, I caught myself in the mirror and saw what my children saw: a middle-aged woman trying too hard, wearing a dress that was perhaps too young for her, hoping for something that probably wasn't coming. The doubt crept in like fog, clouding my reflection until all I could see were the lines around my eyes, the softness around my middle, the evidence that time had passed while I wasn't paying attention. I almost canceled the date. I stood there with my phone in my hand, ready to text David some excuse about not feeling well, ready to change into my comfortable pajamas and accept that my children were right. But then I remembered Mrs. Patterson in her garden, planting flowers at 78 because she believed in tomorrow, because she refused to let anyone else's expectations limit her possibilities. I put the phone down, touched up my lipstick, and grabbed my purse. David was waiting at the restaurant when I arrived, and his face lit up when he saw me. He stood to pull out my chair, complimented my dress, asked about my day with genuine interest. For 2 hours, I wasn't Lois the overwhelmed mother or Lois the aging divorcee. I was just Lois, a woman with opinions about books and politics and whether the tiramisu was worth the extra calories. I laughed until my sides hurt, shared stories I hadn't told in years, and felt something I'd almost forgotten existed: the simple pleasure of being seen and appreciated for who I was rather than what I could provide. But the spell broke the moment I walked back into my house. Emma was waiting in the living room, her arms crossed, her expression a perfect mixture of disappointment and concern. "How was your date, Mom?" she asked, and the way she said the word date made it sound like something vaguely distasteful. "Did you have a good time pretending to be someone you're not?" The question hit me like a slap. Pretending to be someone I wasn't? Who did she think I was? When had enjoying dinner and conversation with a kind man become pretense? When had laughing and feeling attractive become an act? I looked at my youngest daughter, this brilliant young woman I had raised to be confident and independent, and realized that she had somehow learned to see her mother as a fixed entity, incapable of growth or change or desire. "I wasn't pretending anything," I said quietly. "I was just having dinner with a friend." Emma rolled her eyes. "Mom, you're 53. Don't you think it's time to accept reality? I mean, what kind of man is really going to want to deal with a woman your age, who has 3 grown children? You're just setting yourself up for disappointment." I stood there in my empty living room, still wearing the dress that had made me feel beautiful just hours before, and felt something crack inside me. Not break entirely, but crack just enough to let in a sliver of light, a possibility I hadn't considered before. What if my children were wrong? What if the reality they wanted me to accept wasn't the only reality available? What if there was another version of my life waiting for me? One where being 53 wasn't a liability but simply a fact. Where having grown children wasn't baggage but evidence of a life well lived. For the first time in months, maybe years, I looked at my daughter and saw not the authority on my life that I'd somehow allowed her to become, but a young woman who was afraid of change, afraid of losing the mother she could control and predict. Her cruelty wasn't really about me at all. It was about her fear that if I became someone new, someone with desires and dreams beyond their childhood home, she might have to grow up and see me as a person rather than just a role. "Good night, Emma," I said, and walked upstairs to my room. I hung up the dress carefully, as if it were something precious, and sat on the edge of my bed looking at my reflection in the dresser mirror. The woman looking back at me wasn't young, but she wasn't finished either. She had raised 3 children, built a career, survived divorce and heartbreak, and the 1,000 small crises that make up a life. She had laugh lines and worry lines and silver threads in her hair, but she also had stories to tell and love to give, and years ahead of her to discover who she might become. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to accept my children's version of reality anymore. I wasn't going to shrink myself to fit their expectations or apologize for wanting more than they thought I deserved. I was going to find out exactly what was possible for a 53-year-old woman who refused to believe her story was over. I just had no idea how dramatically that story was about to change, or that the man who would turn my world upside down was already much closer than I could have imagined. But that was still to come. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. For now, I simply sat in my quiet room and made peace with the idea that disappointing my children might be the first step toward finally living for myself. 3 weeks later, I was sitting in my favorite corner booth at Marlowe's Cafe, nervously adjusting my napkin while waiting for someone I'd never expected to meet. His name was Alexander Harrison, and our introduction had come through the most unlikely circumstances. I'd been volunteering at the annual charity auction for the Children's Hospital, something I'd done quietly for the past 5 years, when the event coordinator mentioned they were still looking for someone to help with donor relations. The biggest contributor, she'd said, was a man who preferred to stay out of the spotlight, but had specifically requested to meet some of the volunteers who worked directly with the families. When Alexander walked into that hospital conference room 2 weeks ago, I'd expected someone older, more formal, perhaps wearing the kind of expensive suit that announced its price tag from across the room. Instead, he was maybe a few years older than me, dressed in dark jeans and a soft gray sweater. with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and an easy smile that made me forget I was supposed to be intimidated. He'd listened intently as I talked about the families I'd worked with, asking thoughtful questions about the programs, and nodding when I shared stories about children whose hospital stays had been made brighter by simple acts of kindness. We'd talked for over an hour, long after the other volunteers had left, and when he asked if I'd like to continue our conversation over coffee sometime, I'd said yes before my usual self-doubt could kick in. I didn't know then that Alexander Harrison was worth more money than I could comprehend, that his philanthropic donations funded entire wings of hospitals and schools across 3 states, that his name appeared on Forbes lists and charity gala invitations. I just knew that he made me laugh, that he asked about my children with genuine interest, and that when he looked at me he seemed to see someone worth knowing. Now, watching him walk through the cafe door with that same easy confidence, I felt my heart speed up in a way I hadn't experienced in years. He spotted me immediately and smiled, weaving through the tables with an unconscious grace that suggested he was comfortable anywhere he went. He slid into the booth across from me and reached across to touch my hand briefly, a gesture so natural and warm that I felt some of my nervousness dissolve. "I'm glad you said yes to this," he said, his voice carrying that slight rasp that came from years of speaking at board meetings and charity events. "I wasn't sure you would." "Why wouldn't I?" I asked, genuinely curious. He paused, studying my face with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Most people, once they find out about my situation, start acting differently, like they're auditioning for something instead of just being themselves." I tilted my head, not understanding. "Your situation?" That's when he told me about the business he'd built from nothing, starting with a small tech company in his garage 23 years ago and growing it into something that now employed thousands of people. About the investments that had multiplied beyond his wildest expectations, the real estate empire that had grown almost accidentally, the fortune that had become both a blessing and a burden. He spoke about money the way other people talked about the weather, as a fact of life that influenced everything but didn't define everything. I sat there absorbing this information, trying to reconcile the man across from me with the image his words created. He wasn't bragging or trying to impress me. If anything, he seemed almost apologetic, as if his success was something he needed to warn me about rather than celebrate. When he finished talking, he leaned back and waited for my reaction, his expression cautious. "So," I said finally, "you're telling me you're rich?" He laughed, a sound of relief and surprise. "That's one way to put it. And you thought this would make me act differently?" "It usually does," he said quietly. "People start calculating, wondering what they can get, how they can position themselves. Or they decide I'm too complicated, too much trouble, that my world is too different from theirs." I looked at this man who had just trusted me with information he clearly guarded carefully. This man who had made me laugh until I forgot to be self-conscious. Who had spent an hour at the hospital talking to grieving parents because he genuinely cared about their children. "Alexander," I said, "I'm a 53-year-old divorced mother who works for a non-profit and drives a 7-year-old Honda. If anyone should be worried about different worlds, it should be me." The relief in his smile was unmistakable. "I was hoping you'd say something like that." Over the next several weeks, we fell into an easy rhythm. Coffee dates that stretched into lunch, phone conversations that lasted until long after I should have been asleep, walks through the botanical gardens, where we talked about everything from his travels to my work, to the books we'd both loved as children. He was nothing like what I'd expected wealth to look like. He drove himself in a modest sedan, preferred small restaurants to fancy ones, and seemed genuinely more interested in hearing about my day than talking about his latest business acquisition. But I was careful not to share too much about our growing relationship with my children. I mentioned Alexander in passing, describing him as someone I'd met through volunteer work, someone nice who I was getting to know. I didn't mention the private jet he occasionally used for business, or the house in Martha's Vineyard where he spent summers, or the casual way he'd mentioned donating $100,000 to the hospital's new pediatric wing. I told myself I was being discreet, protecting something precious and new from their criticism, but the truth was I was terrified of their reaction. Emma, home for spring break, had already made several pointed comments about my busy social calendar, as she called it. "Mom, you're out more nights than I am," she'd said the week before, her tone suggesting this was somehow inappropriate. "What's going on with you lately?" Marcus had been more direct during one of his brief visits. "I hope you're not getting too serious about anyone," he'd said while raiding my refrigerator for leftovers. "You need to think about your future, Mom. You can't afford to make mistakes at your age." Even Sarah, usually the most diplomatic of my children, had started asking probing questions about my friend from the hospital. "Is he divorced too?" she'd wanted to know. "Does he have children? What does he do for work?" Her psychology training made her questions feel more like an interrogation than casual interest. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was hiding the best thing that had happened to me in years from the people who claimed to love me most. Alexander had brought something back to life in me that I'd thought was gone forever. When I was with him, I remembered what it felt like to be desired, not just needed. He looked at me like I was beautiful, listened to my opinions like they mattered, treated me like a woman with her own dreams and desires, rather than just a supporting character in other people's stories. One evening in late March, Alexander picked me up for dinner at a restaurant I'd never heard of, but that turned out to be the kind of place where the maitre d' knew his name, and the chef personally brought out small plates for us to try. I was wearing a new dress, something I'd bought specifically for our dates, and I felt more like myself than I had in years. We talked about a trip he was planning to Italy, and when he mentioned that he'd love to show me the art museums in Florence someday, my heart did a small flip at the casual assumption that we had a someday. It was nearly 10 when he dropped me off at home, walking me to the front door like the gentleman he always was. The house was dark except for the porch light, and I assumed my children were all out or asleep. Alexander kissed me goodnight, a soft, sweet kiss that tasted like possibility, and I watched him drive away before using my key to slip quietly inside. That's when I heard voices coming from the kitchen. All 3 of my children were sitting around the table, their laptops open, looking like they were conducting some kind of family meeting. They looked up when I walked in, their expressions ranging from concerned to accusatory. "Mom," Marcus said, his voice taking on that patronizing tone he'd perfected in college, "we need to talk." I set my purse down slowly, my good mood evaporating like steam. "About what?" "About this man you've been seeing," Sarah said, closing her laptop with a decisive snap. "We've been doing some research." My blood went cold. "Research?" Emma pulled out her phone and started scrolling through something. "Alexander Harrison, 57, net worth approximately $2.3 billion according to Forbes. CEO of Harrison Technologies, major real estate holdings, serves on the boards of 6 different charities." She looked up at me with an expression of triumph mixed with disappointment. "Mom, this man is completely out of your league." The words hit me like a physical blow. Out of my league. As if I were some kind of minor league player who had accidentally wandered onto a professional field. As if the past 2 months of laughter and connection and growing feelings were somehow fraudulent, because our bank accounts didn't match. "Did you even know who he was when you started dating him?" Marcus demanded. "Or did you find out about the money and decide to go for it?" The accusation was so unfair, so cruel that I actually gasped. "How can you say that to me?" "Because we're worried about you," Sarah said, her voice taking on the patient tone she probably used with difficult clients. "Mom, men like this don't date women like you unless they want something specific. Maybe he's looking for someone temporary, someone who won't expect too much. Or maybe he gets some kind of thrill from the power dynamic." "Women like me?" I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. "What exactly does that mean?" Emma looked uncomfortable but pressed on. "Mom, come on. You're a nice middle-class woman with a regular job and 3 kids. He's a billionaire. He probably dates supermodels and actresses. Why would he be interested in you unless there was some angle we're not seeing?" The kitchen fell silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of my heart breaking. My own children, the people I had raised to be kind and thoughtful and open-minded, were telling me that I was so inherently unworthy that any man who showed interest in me must have ulterior motives. They couldn't conceive of a world where I might be valuable for who I was rather than what I could provide or what someone could get from me. "Get out," I said quietly. They stared at me, clearly not expecting this reaction. "Mom, we're just trying to protect you," Marcus said. We don't want to see you get hurt when he gets bored and moves on to someone more appropriate. Get out of my house, I said, louder this time, my voice shaking with rage and hurt. All of you. Right now. Mom, you're being dramatic, Emma said, rolling her eyes. We're just being realistic. You're being cruel, I said, standing up and pointing toward the door. You're being small and mean, and I want you to leave. Now. They left, but not without making it clear that they thought I was making a terrible mistake, that I was being foolish and naive and setting myself up for humiliation. Emma muttered something about middle-aged women and their delusions as she gathered her things. Marcus shook his head like I was a child throwing a tantrum. Sarah tried to hug me goodbye, but I stepped away from her. When the house was finally quiet, I sat in my kitchen and cried harder than I had since the day my ex-husband left. But these weren't just tears of hurt. They were tears of rage. I was furious at my children for their cruelty, furious at myself for raising people who could be so heartless, furious at a world that had taught them that their mother was so worthless that any man who wanted her must be running some kind of con. I thought about calling Alexander, but what would I say? That my children thought I was too pathetic to deserve him? That they had researched his net worth like he was a stock they were considering buying? That they believed the only reason a successful man would want me was if he had some kind of psychological problem or hidden agenda? Instead, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat in my living room, looking at the family photos that lined the mantel. Pictures of birthday parties and graduations, Christmas mornings and summer vacations, all the moments when we had been happy together. When had my children become so harsh? When had they learned to see love as a transaction rather than a gift? When had they decided that their mother was so fundamentally flawed that anyone who cared about her must be damaged or deceptive? The worst part was that their words had planted seeds of doubt that I couldn't seem to uproot. What if they were right? What if Alexander was just amusing himself with me, enjoying some kind of fantasy before returning to his real life? What if I was being naive and ridiculous, a middle-aged woman too desperate for love to see clearly? But then I remembered the way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention, the gentle way he touched my hand when he made a point, the genuine interest in his voice when he asked about my work. I remembered how he'd spent an entire evening listening to me talk about my children, how he'd encouraged me to share my dreams about traveling, how he'd never once made me feel small or inadequate. My children saw his wealth and assumed it made me lesser by comparison. But Alexander had never treated me that way. He'd been careful to choose modest restaurants for our early dates, sensitive to the fact that our financial situations were different. He'd never flaunted his wealth or made me feel uncomfortable about my own circumstances. He'd simply been kind and interested and present, the qualities that actually mattered in any relationship. As I sat there in the dark, I realized that this moment was a test, not of Alexander's intentions, which had been nothing but honorable, but of my own courage. Was I going to let my children's narrow vision of what I deserved dictate my choices? Was I going to shrink back into the safe, small life they wanted for me? Or was I going to fight for something real and beautiful and rare? The answer came to me with startling clarity. I was done making myself smaller to fit other people's expectations. I was done apologizing for wanting love, for deserving happiness, for believing that my worth wasn't determined by my bank account or my age or my children's approval. I picked up my phone and typed a text to Alexander. I know it's late, but could we talk tomorrow? There's something I need to tell you. His response came back almost immediately. Of course. Everything okay? I stared at the question for a long time before typing back. It will be. And for the first time in hours, I believed it. Whatever happened next, I wasn't going to let fear or other people's limitations keep me from finding out what was possible. My children had shown me exactly who they were tonight, and it was time for me to show them exactly who I was becoming. The next morning came too early and too bright. I'd barely slept, tossing and turning while my children's words echoed in my head like a broken record. Women like you. Out of your league. What does he really want? By 6 a.m., I gave up on sleep entirely and made coffee with shaking hands, staring out the kitchen window at the same view I'd looked at for 20 years, feeling like a stranger in my own life. Alexander had texted around 7, asking if I wanted to meet for breakfast before he flew to Chicago for a business meeting. Under normal circumstances, I would have said yes immediately. The thought of spending even an hour with him before he left would have made my whole day brighter. But sitting there in my bathrobe, surrounded by the echoes of my children's cruelty, I couldn't imagine facing him. How could I look him in the eye knowing that my own family had researched his net worth like he was a commodity? How could I pretend that their words hadn't burrowed into my brain like parasites, eating away at every good feeling I'd built up over the past 2 months? I typed and deleted a dozen different responses before finally settling on something brief and non-committal. Can't make breakfast. Have a safe flight. We'll talk when you get back. I hit send before I could second-guess myself, then immediately wanted to take it back. The response felt cold, distant, nothing like the warmth we'd built between us. But I couldn't seem to access that warmth anymore. It was buried under layers of doubt and hurt and shame. He called 20 minutes later, and I let it go to voicemail. Then he called again, and again I let it ring. The third time, I turned my phone face down on the counter and walked away, my heart pounding like I was running from something dangerous. In a way, I suppose I was. I was running from the possibility that my children might be right, that I was deluding myself, that I was about to be humiliated in a way I might never recover from. The voicemail he left was everything I should have expected from him, and nothing like what my children had predicted. His voice was gentle, concerned, without a trace of the impatience or condescension they'd warned me about. "Lois, I'm worried about you. Something's wrong, and I can't help if I don't know what it is. Call me back, please. Whatever it is, we can work through it together." I played the message 3 times, each time feeling my heart crack a little more. He sounded like a man who cared, like someone who was genuinely worried about my well-being, rather than calculating what he could get from me. But doubt is a poison that works slowly, and by the 4th listen, I was analyzing his tone for hidden meanings, wondering if the concern was real or performed. That afternoon, Emma returned to get some things she'd forgotten in her rush to leave the night before. She let herself in without knocking, as she always did, and found me still in my pajamas on the living room couch, surrounded by used tissues and the kind of mindless daytime television I never watched. "Mom," she said, her voice softer than it had been the night before, "you look terrible." I didn't respond. What was there to say? That her words had gutted me? That for the first time in 25 years of being her mother, I was genuinely ashamed of her? That I was questioning everything I thought I knew about the children I'd raised? She sat down on the coffee table facing me, her expression a mixture of guilt and stubborn righteousness. "Look, I know we were harsh last night, but we're just trying to protect you. This guy Alexander, he's not like us. He's not like anyone we know. Don't you think it's weird that he chose you out of all the women he could have?" The casual cruelty of the question took my breath away. Chose me out of all the women he could have. As if I were some consolation prize, some random selection that required explanation. As if the idea that someone might genuinely want me for who I was so far-fetched that it demanded investigation. "Emma," I said quietly, "do you hear yourself? Do you understand what you're saying to me?" She looked uncomfortable but didn't back down. "I'm saying that men with that kind of money don't usually date regular people unless there's something else going on. Maybe he's going through a divorce and needs to look stable. Maybe he's having some kind of midlife crisis and wants to feel normal for a while. Maybe he likes the idea of being with someone who'll be grateful for whatever attention he gives her." Each possibility she listed felt like a small knife being twisted in my chest. The idea that my gratitude for basic human kindness made me pathetic. The suggestion that I was some kind of temporary experiment in normalcy. The assumption that any relationship I might have was inherently transactional, that love was something that happened to other people but never to me. "Get out," I said again, just as I had the night before. "Mom, you're being ridiculous. We're your family. We know you better than some man you've known for 2 months. We're the ones who'll be here to pick up the pieces when this falls apart." I looked at my youngest daughter, this beautiful young woman I'd raised to be strong and independent and confident, and realized that somewhere along the way, I'd failed her completely. Not in the ways I'd always worried about, not by working too much or being too tired or not having enough money for the things she wanted. I'd failed her by teaching her that women like her mother weren't worth loving, that settling was virtuous, that wanting more than you had was dangerous and foolish. Emma, I said, standing up from the couch with more energy than I'd felt all day. I want you to leave, and I don't want you to come back until you can treat me with basic respect. Her mouth dropped open. In 20 years of being her mother, I had never disinvited her from her childhood home. You can't be serious. I am completely serious. You and your brothers have made it clear that you think I'm pathetic and desperate and unworthy of love. You've researched the man I'm dating like he's a stock investment gone wrong. You've told me I'm out of his league, as if I'm some kind of minor league player who wandered onto a professional field by mistake. And you've done all of this while claiming it's because you love me. Emma's face flushed red. We do love you. That's why we're trying to save you from making a huge mistake. The only mistake I've made, I said, my voice growing stronger with each word, is raising children who think so little of their mother that they can't imagine anyone else thinking more of her. She stared at me for a long moment, her expression cycling through shock, hurt, and finally anger. Fine, she said, grabbing her bag from the hallway table. But don't come crying to us when this blows up in your face. Don't expect us to pretend we didn't warn you when he dumps you for someone younger and prettier and more sophisticated. The doors slammed behind her hard enough to rattle the windows, and I was alone again. But this time the silence felt different. Not empty, but expectant, like the pause between lightning and thunder. Something was building inside me, something that felt dangerous and necessary, and long overdue. I spent the next 3 days in a fog of self-doubt and recrimination. Alexander sent flowers with a note that said simply, "Missing you. Call when you're ready." I put them in a vase and stared at them for hours. Beautiful white roses that deserved better than to wilt in the home of a woman too cowardly to accept love when it was offered. Marcus came by on Thursday, ostensibly to check on me but really to double down on the intervention my children had clearly planned. He brought takeout from my favorite Thai restaurant, probably hoping that familiar comfort food would soften me up for whatever lecture he'd prepared. "Mom," he said, settling into the kitchen chair across from me with the casual authority he'd inherited from his father. "I've been thinking about your situation, and I have some concerns." The phrase, "your situation," grated on my nerves like nails on a chalkboard. As if my budding relationship with a kind, intelligent man was a problem to be solved rather than a gift to be celebrated. "I'm listening," I said, though every fiber of my being wanted to tell him to leave. "I did some research on Alexander Harrison," he began, pulling out his phone like he was about to present evidence in a court case. "He's been married twice before, both times to women significantly younger than him. Both marriages ended in divorce, and both ex-wives signed pretty aggressive non-disclosure agreements." My stomach clenched. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying there's a pattern here, Mom. He dates down, marries women who are impressed by his money and status, and when he gets bored, he pays them to stay quiet about whatever happened during the marriage. You could be next." The casual way he said "dates down" hit me like a physical blow. My own son, the boy I'd rocked to sleep and cheered for at soccer games and helped with homework until my eyes burned, was telling me that any man who wanted me was automatically lowering his standards. "Marcus," I said slowly, "do you understand that you're talking about your mother? Do you hear what you're saying?" He had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable, but he pressed on. "I'm saying that men like Harrison don't usually end up with women like you unless there's something in it for them. Maybe he likes the idea of being with someone normal for a while. Maybe he's got some kind of savior complex. Maybe he gets off on the power dynamic." There it was again. Women like you. The phrase that had haunted me for days, that had turned Alexander's kindness into something suspicious, and my own feelings into evidence of desperation. My children had reduced me to a category, a type, a demographic, that was inherently less worthy of love than other demographics. "I want you to leave," I said quietly. "Mom, come on, I'm trying to help you." "No," I said, standing up from the table, "you're trying to control me. You're trying to keep me small and manageable and grateful for whatever scraps of attention you're willing to give me. You're trying to convince me that wanting love is pathetic, and that anyone who might love me must have something wrong with them. Marcus stood up too, his expression hardening into the stubborn look he'd worn as a teenager when he didn't want to admit he was wrong. "I'm trying to keep you from getting hurt, from making a fool of yourself. This guy is going to chew you up and spit you out, and we're the ones who'll have to deal with the aftermath." The phrase "making a fool of yourself" echoed in my head long after he left. When had loving someone become foolish? When had hope become humiliation? When had my children learned to see their mother as a fragile, pathetic creature who needed to be protected from her own desires? That night, I did something I hadn't done in 20 years. I got drunk. Not falling down, sloppy drunk, but wine with dinner drunk that turned into wine with dessert drunk that turned into wine instead of dessert drunk. I sat in my living room with a bottle of red wine and looked at the family photos that documented 2 decades of putting everyone else's needs before my own, of smiling when I wanted to scream, of making myself smaller and smaller until I nearly disappeared entirely. In one photo, taken at Marcus's college graduation, I was standing slightly behind my children, my hands on their shoulders, my smile bright and proud and completely focused on their achievements. I looked like what I had become, a supporting character in their story, someone whose value was entirely dependent on what she could provide for the real protagonists. In another photo, from Emma's high school graduation, I was wearing a beige dress that I'd chosen specifically because it wouldn't draw attention away from her. My hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, my makeup minimal, my whole appearance designed to fade into the background. I had made myself invisible at my own daughter's graduation, and I'd thought that was love. But Alexander had never asked me to fade into the background. He'd introduced me to colleagues and friends with pride, holding my hand in public, asking for my opinions on everything from restaurant choices to art exhibits. He'd treated me like someone worth being seen with, worth listening to, worth loving. And my children had convinced me that this treatment was so unusual, so inexplicable, that it must be evidence of some hidden pathology. The wine made me brave enough to do something I'd been avoiding for days. I pulled out my laptop and Googled Alexander Harrison. Not because I doubted him, but because I wanted to see what my children had seen, to understand what had made them so certain that he was out of my league. The search results were overwhelming. Pages and pages of articles about his business success, his charitable giving, his appearances at high-profile events. Photos of him at galas and board meetings, looking confident and successful and completely at home in a world of wealth and influence. And yes, there were photos of him with his ex-wives, both of them young and beautiful in the way that made magazine covers and gossip columns. But as I scrolled through article after article, I started to see something my children had missed. In every interview, in every profile, Alexander came across as someone who was quietly searching for something money couldn't buy. He talked about the loneliness that came with success, the difficulty of forming genuine connections when people wanted something from you, the way wealth could isolate you from the very experiences that made life meaningful. In one interview from 2 years ago, he'd been asked about his personal life, and his answer had been telling. "I'm not looking for someone to impress with what I have," he'd said. "I'm looking for someone who makes me want to be better than I am, someone who sees the man rather than the bank account." Reading those words, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't a man who dated down or who needed to feel superior to his partners. This was a man who had been searching for the same thing I had been searching for: genuine connection, real love, someone who valued him for who he was rather than what he could provide. My children had looked at his wealth and assumed it made him shallow, predatory, someone who used his money to manipulate vulnerable women. But they'd never considered the possibility that his wealth made him lonely, that it made finding real love more difficult rather than easier, that it attracted the wrong kind of attention from people who wanted to use him just as much as he supposedly wanted to use others. I closed the laptop and poured another glass of wine, feeling something I hadn't felt in days: clarity. My children were wrong. Not just about Alexander, but about me, about love, about what I deserved and what was possible. They had spent so many years seeing me as their mother, their caretaker, their safety net, that they couldn't conceive of me as a woman with her own desires and worth. But being wrong about Alexander was just the symptom. The real disease was deeper, more painful, and harder to cure. My children had learned somewhere, somehow, that their mother was not the kind of woman who deserved great love. They had internalized the message that women like me, middle-aged women with ordinary jobs and everyday problems, were inherently less valuable than younger, prettier, more sophisticated women. And the most devastating part was that I had taught them this. Through 20 years of putting myself last, of accepting less than I deserved, of making myself smaller to make room for their dreams, I had shown them that mothers don't matter the way other people matter. That self-sacrifice was love, and that wanting anything for yourself was selfish. I had created my own prison, and my children were the guards, making sure I never escaped into a life that might take attention away from theirs. The next morning, I woke up with a headache and a clarity that felt like stepping out of a fog. Alexander was due back from Chicago that afternoon, and he'd texted asking if we could have dinner. I'd been avoiding him for 4 days, and I knew he deserved an explanation. More than that, I deserved the chance to find out what was possible between us, regardless of what my children thought about it. But first, I had something else to do. I picked up my phone and called Sarah, who answered on the second ring with a cautious hello. "Sarah," I said, "I need you to understand something. You and your brothers have spent the last week trying to convince me that I'm not worthy of love, that any man who wants me must have ulterior motives, and that my happiness is less important than your comfort with my choices." There was silence on the other end of the line. Then a sigh. "Mom, that's not what we were trying to do." "That's exactly what you were trying to do," I said firmly, "and it worked. I've spent 4 days questioning everything good in my life because my own children convinced me that I don't deserve it. But I'm done with that now. Mom, we just don't want you to get hurt." "You've already hurt me," I said, "more than any man ever could. You've told me I'm out of Alexander's league, that men like him don't date women like me, that I should be grateful for whatever attention I can get because I'm not worthy of anything better. Do you understand how cruel that is?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was small. "We didn't mean it like that." "How did you mean it?" I asked. "Because from where I'm sitting, it sounds like you meant exactly that. It sounds like you think your mother is so fundamentally flawed that anyone who cares about her must be running some kind of con. That's not true." "Then prove it," I said. "Stop researching the man I'm dating like he's a threat to national security. Stop assuming that my judgment is so poor that I can't recognize genuine kindness when I see it. Stop treating my happiness like a problem that needs to be solved." I hung up before she could respond, my hands shaking with adrenaline and something that felt like freedom. For the first time in days, I felt like myself again, not the version of myself my children wanted me to be, small and grateful and contained, but the version Alexander saw when he looked at me, worthy of love, capable of making good choices, deserving of happiness. I had lost 4 days to my children's doubts, 4 days of avoiding the best thing that had happened to me in years, because I was afraid they might be right. But they weren't right. They were just scared of losing the mother they could control, the woman who existed entirely for their benefit. I wasn't that woman anymore. I was Lois Campbell, and I was 53 years old, and I was worthy of love. Real love. From a man who saw my value and chose me not because he was damaged or desperate, but because he recognized something in me worth cherishing. It was time to find out what that love could become. I met Alexander at his hotel that evening, my heart hammering against my ribs as I walked through the elegant lobby of the Grand Metropolitan. He'd offered to pick me up, as he always did, but I needed the drive to collect my thoughts, to rehearse what I was going to say. 4 days of silence had created a chasm between us that felt both necessary and tragic, and I wasn't sure how to bridge it without explaining the ugliness that had caused it. He was waiting in the hotel bar, a quiet space with leather chairs and soft lighting that felt like a sanctuary from the chaos in my head. When he saw me, his face lit up with relief and something deeper, something that looked like genuine joy at seeing me again. He stood to greet me, and for a moment I thought he might kiss me, but he seemed to sense my fragility and settled for taking my hands in his instead. "Lois," he said softly, "I was starting to think I'd lost you." The simple honesty in his voice nearly undid me. Here was a man who had every reason to be impatient with my sudden disappearance, who could have easily found someone else to spend his time with, who had no obligation to wait for a middle-aged woman to sort through her emotional baggage. Instead, he'd sent flowers and gentle messages, giving me space while making it clear that he was still there, still hoping. "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it more than I'd ever meant anything. I needed some time to think. "About us?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "About me," I replied. "About whether I'm brave enough for this." We found a quiet corner table, and over wine that tasted like liquid courage, I told him everything. About my children's research into his background, about their assumptions and accusations, about the way they'd made me feel small and worthless and undeserving. I watched his face as I spoke, looking for signs of anger or disgust, or the kind of condescending pity that would prove my children right. Instead, I saw understanding, and something that looked like recognition. "I'm sorry," he said when I finished. "That must have been incredibly painful." "It was," I admitted. But what scared me more was that part of me believed them. Part of me thought they might be right. That I was deluding myself about your interest. That I was reaching for something beyond my grasp. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, turning his wine glass in his hands. When he looked up at me, his expression was gentle but serious. "Lois, can I tell you something? When I was building my first company, back when I was living on ramen noodles and sleeping on a futon in my office, I started dating a woman named Jennifer. She was a lawyer, brilliant and beautiful, and completely out of my league financially. Her friends couldn't understand what she saw in me, this scruffy entrepreneur with no money and no prospects. They warned her I was probably using her, that I was going to drag her down with me when my business inevitably failed. I leaned forward, captivated despite myself. What happened? She listened to them, he said simply. She started pulling away, questioning everything about our relationship, analyzing every gesture I made for hidden motives. She turned something beautiful into something suspicious, and eventually, she ended it. 6 months later, my company got its first major investment. 5 years later, I sold it for $50 million. But Jennifer was gone, and I've always wondered what might have been if she'd trusted her heart instead of other people's fears. The parallel wasn't lost on me. Are you saying I'm making the same mistake? I'm saying that people who love you sometimes give you terrible advice because they can't see past their own limitations, he replied. Your children love you, I'm sure of that. But they've put you in a box marked mother, and they can't imagine you existing outside of it. The idea that you might be desirable, that you might deserve romance and passion and adventure, threatens their understanding of who you are. His words hit me like a revelation. It wasn't that my children didn't love me. It was that they loved a version of me that was safe and predictable, and entirely devoted to their needs. The thought that I might have desires of my own, that I might want to build a life that didn't revolve around them, was more than they could process. There's something else, Alexander said, his voice taking on a more hesitant tone. Something I probably should have told you earlier, but I was afraid it would scare you away. My stomach clenched. What is it? My ex-wives, he said. Your son was right about some things. They were both younger than me, and both marriages ended badly, but not for the reasons he probably thinks. I waited, my heart pounding. They both married me for my money, he continued. Not entirely, maybe not even consciously, but money was definitely part of the attraction. And when they realized that wealth couldn't fill whatever emptiness they were trying to escape, when they discovered that being rich doesn't automatically make you happy, they both became bitter and resentful. They felt tricked somehow, like I had false advertised what our life together would be like. What do you mean? I mean they thought marrying a wealthy man would solve all their problems, make them feel fulfilled and special and loved. When it didn't, when they realized that money is just money and that real happiness comes from connection and purpose and growth, they blamed me, as if I had deliberately misled them about what wealth could provide. I absorbed this information, trying to understand what he was telling me. And you think I'm different? I know you're different, he said with quiet certainty. You've never once asked me about my money, never hinted that you'd like expensive gifts or lavish trips. When I offered to fly you to New York for the weekend, you said you'd rather take the train, because you enjoy watching the countryside. When I suggested dinner at Le Bernardin, you asked if we could try that little Italian place you'd been curious about instead. It was true. I had been more interested in his stories than his bank account, more impressed by his kindness to wait staff than by his ability to get the best table in any restaurant. But I'd never thought of this as unusual. It was just who I was. Lois, he said, reaching across the table to take my hand. I've spent years wondering if anyone would ever want me for who I am rather than what I have. You've given me something I'd almost given up hope of finding. The certainty that you see me, the actual person, not the public figure or the net worth or the lifestyle. Do you have any idea how rare that is? I looked at this man who had become so important to me, this man my children had reduced to a predator seeking easy prey, and saw him clearly for perhaps the first time. He wasn't trying to take advantage of me. He was hoping I wouldn't take advantage of him. He wasn't looking for someone to manipulate. He was looking for someone real, in a world full of people who wanted to use him. I do see you, I said softly. I see someone who spent an hour talking to grieving parents at the hospital because he genuinely cared. I see someone who tips restaurant servers generously, but never makes a show of it. I see someone who asks about my day not because he's being polite, but because he's actually interested in the answer. The relief in his smile was transformative. Then we're seeing each other clearly, he said. And maybe that's enough to build something real on, regardless of what anyone else thinks. Over the next several weeks, something shifted in our relationship. Not because of what we'd shared that night, though that conversation had cleared the air between us, but because I had finally stopped apologizing for wanting him. I stopped second-guessing every kind gesture, stopped analyzing his motivations, stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop. Instead, I allowed myself to enjoy what we were building together. Alexander was planning a trip to his house in Martha's Vineyard, and he asked if I'd like to join him for a long weekend. 6 months ago, the invitation would have sent me into a spiral of anxiety about appropriateness and what my children would think. Now, I said yes immediately, excitement fluttering in my chest like a teenager planning her first getaway. The house was nothing like what I'd expected. Yes, it was large and beautifully appointed, with views of the ocean that took my breath away. But it was also comfortable and lived in, filled with books and art, and the kind of personal touches that made it feel like a home rather than a showplace. Alexander gave me the guest suite, respecting boundaries we hadn't explicitly discussed, and spent the weekend showing me the island like a local rather than a tourist. We rode bikes through Edgartown, explored the cliffs at Aquina, and spent hours walking on beaches that stretched for miles without seeing another soul. In the evenings, we cooked together in his kitchen, sharing stories and wine and the kind of easy domesticity I hadn't experienced since the early days of my marriage. It was during one of these evenings that he told me something that changed everything. I've been thinking about retiring, he said as we sat on the deck watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. I looked at him in surprise. Really? You're only 57? Exactly, he said. Young enough to do something different, to travel, to spend time on things that matter to me rather than things that just make money. What would you do? He was quiet for a moment, staring out at the water. I'd like to work more directly with the charities I support. Maybe start a foundation focused on education initiatives in underserved communities. I've been funding these programs for years, but I'd like to be more hands-on, to see the impact firsthand. There was something in his voice, a longing that went beyond professional ambition. That sounds wonderful, I said. What's stopping you? Nothing, really. I have good people running the companies, more money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes, and no real ties keeping me in any particular place. He turned to look at me, his expression serious. The question is whether I'd be doing it alone. My heart stopped. Alexander. I'm not asking you to make any decisions tonight, he said quickly. I'm just saying that when I think about my future, about what I want the next chapter of my life to look like, I can't imagine it without you." I stared at this man who had somehow seen past every doubt and insecurity my children had tried to plant in my mind, who had looked at a 53-year-old divorced mother and seen someone worth building a future with. The girl I'd been at 20 would have been overwhelmed by the scope of what he was offering. The woman I'd become at 53 was simply grateful to be seen so clearly. "I can't imagine my future without you either," I said, the words coming out more easily than I'd expected. That night, for the first time since we'd known each other, I didn't sleep in the guest room. What happened between us was tender and sweet, and nothing like the transactional encounter my children had predicted. It was two people who had found each other later in life, grateful for second chances, and unafraid of the depth of feeling they'd discovered. When we returned to Maplewood 3 days later, I felt like a different person. Not because Alexander had changed me, but because I had finally stopped hiding from who I was. I'd spent so many years being careful, being appropriate, being the kind of mother my children expected me to be, that I'd forgotten what it felt like to live boldly. But my transformation was just beginning. A week after we returned from the vineyard, Alexander asked me to accompany him to a charity gala in Boston. It was the kind of high-profile event I would have found intimidating before, full of wealthy donors and social prominence, but I found myself looking forward to it. Not because I wanted to play dress-up in his world, but because I wanted to support something he cared about. The gala was being held to raise money for the Children's Hospital, where we'd first met, and Alexander was being honored for his years of support. I wore a simple black dress I'd found at a boutique in town, nothing flashy or expensive, but something that made me feel confident and elegant. When Alexander saw me, his expression told me everything I needed to know about how I looked. The evening was magical in ways I couldn't have anticipated. Alexander introduced me to doctors whose research he funded, to parents whose children had benefited from his donations, to fellow philanthropists who spoke about him with genuine respect and affection. I wasn't arm candy or a curiosity. I was his partner, someone he was proud to have by his side. But the most powerful moment came during his acceptance speech. He talked about the importance of community support for children's health care, about the responsibility that comes with good fortune, about the satisfaction of giving back. And then, near the end, he said something that made my heart soar. "I've learned recently that the best kind of wealth isn't what you accumulate, but what you share. Not just money, but time and attention and love. I've been fortunate to find someone who understands that true richness comes from connection, from caring about something bigger than yourself. Someone who sees the man rather than the bank account, who challenges me to be better than I thought I could be." He looked directly at me as he spoke, and I felt tears prick my eyes. This wasn't a man using his wealth to impress a desperate woman. This was a man who had found love and wanted to celebrate it publicly. The applause was thunderous, but all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. This man, this wonderful, generous, complicated man, was talking about me. About us. About a future I was only just beginning to believe in. After the gala, we walked along the harbor in Boston, my hand in his, talking about the evening, and the people we'd met, and the work that lay ahead. It was nearly midnight when he stopped walking and turned to face me, his expression serious in the glow of the street lamps. "Lois," he said, "I have something to ask you, and I want you to think carefully before you answer." My breath caught. "What is it?" "I know we've only known each other for a few months, and I know your children have concerns about us. But I also know that what we have is real and rare and worth fighting for." He paused, seeming to gather his courage. "I want you to move in with me. Not because I want to take care of you or because I think you need taken care of, but because I want to build a life with you. I want to wake up next to you and fall asleep holding you and share all the ordinary, extraordinary moments that make up a day." I stared at him, this man who had somehow seen past every limitation I'd accepted about myself, who had looked at my life and seen possibility instead of problems. 6 months ago, the idea would have been unthinkable, not just because of my children's disapproval, but because I wouldn't have believed I deserved it. "Yes," I said, the word coming out strong and clear and certain. "Yes, I want that too." He kissed me then, right there on the Boston Harbor, and I felt like I was in a movie or a dream or some alternate version of my life where middle-aged women got fairy tale endings. But it wasn't a fairy tale. It was better than that. It was real life, messy and complicated and absolutely perfect. When I got home that night, there were 17 missed calls and 43 text messages from my children. Apparently, someone at the gala had posted photos on social media, and my children had seen their mother standing next to Alexander Harrison at a black tie event, looking happy and confident, and completely at home in a world they'd convinced themselves she didn't belong in. I didn't call them back. Instead, I poured myself a glass of wine, sat on my couch, and started making a mental list of everything I needed to do to change my life completely. It was a long list, but for the first time in years, I wasn't overwhelmed by the magnitude of change ahead of me. I was excited by it. The next morning, I called my boss at the nonprofit and gave my notice. I'd been planning to work until I was 65, maybe longer, but Alexander's talk of retirement and new adventures had made me realize that I didn't want to spend the next 12 years in the same office, doing the same work, waiting for someday to arrive. My boss was surprised but understanding, especially when I explained that I'd be continuing my volunteer work with the hospital and possibly expanding into other charitable initiatives. "You're glowing, Lois," she said. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." That afternoon, I met with a realtor about selling the house on Elmwood Street. It was time to let go of the museum of my former life, to stop living in spaces designed around other people's needs. The house would sell quickly, she assured me. It was in a desirable neighborhood, well-maintained, perfect for a young family looking to put down roots. As I walked through the rooms with her, pointing out features and recent improvements, I felt surprisingly little sadness. This house had served its purpose, had sheltered my children, and given us stability during the uncertain years after their father left. But it was also a symbol of a life that no longer fit, a testament to a woman who had made herself smaller and smaller until she nearly disappeared entirely. That evening, Alexander came over to help me start the process of deciding what to keep and what to leave behind. We worked room by room, sorting through 20 years of accumulated possessions, and I was amazed by how little of it I actually wanted to take with me. The furniture chosen for durability rather than beauty, the kitchen gadgets I'd never really liked but had kept because they were gifts, the decorations that reflected my children's tastes rather than my own. "It's like I was living in someone else's house," I said as we packed up books in the living room. "In a way, you were," Alexander replied gently. "You were living in the house that Lois the mother needed, not the house that Lois the woman wanted." He was right. For 20 years, every decision about this house had been filtered through the lens of what was best for my children. The beige walls that wouldn't show fingerprints, the practical furniture that could withstand teenage parties, the neutral colors that wouldn't offend anyone's preferences. I had created a space that was functional and safe and completely devoid of my own personality. 3 weeks later, I was loading the last box into the moving truck when Emma's car pulled into the driveway. She got out slowly, looking around at the house she'd grown up in like she was seeing it for the first time. Or maybe seeing it for the last time. "Mom," she said, her voice small and uncertain. "What are you doing?" "I'm moving," I said simply. "I thought you knew." She looked at the moving truck, at the boxes stacked in the driveway, at my face, which probably showed more peace than she'd seen there in years. "Where are you going?" "To live with Alexander," I said. "We're starting a life together." Emma's face cycled through a dozen different emotions before settling on something that looked like panic. "You can't just leave. This is our home. Where are we supposed to go for holidays? Where will we bring our kids when we have them?" The questions revealed everything I needed to know about how my children saw me. Not as a person with my own life to live, but as a resource to be preserved, a home base to be maintained, a constant in their lives regardless of what I might want for myself. "Emma," I said gently, "you're 19 years old. You have your own life, your own dreams, your own future to build. You don't need me to keep this house as a shrine to your childhood." "But what if we need you?" she asked, and for the first time in months her voice held genuine vulnerability instead of entitled judgment. "Then you'll call me," I said. "And I'll be there, just like I always have been, but I'll be there as someone who chose to help you, not as someone who has no other options. She stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her struggling to reconcile this new version of her mother with the woman she'd always taken for granted. "I don't understand what's happening to you," she said finally. "I'm becoming myself," I replied. "For the first time in 20 years, I'm choosing what I want instead of what everyone else needs from me." That evening, as I stood in the empty house one last time, I thought about all the versions of myself that had lived within these walls. The young mother who had been so afraid of making mistakes. The exhausted single parent who had sacrificed sleep and sanity to keep everything together. The middle-aged woman who had convinced herself that being needed was the same thing as being loved. All of those women had been necessary, had served their purpose, had gotten me to this moment when I could finally choose love over fear, possibility over safety, adventure over comfort. I was grateful to them, but I was ready to let them go. Tomorrow, I would wake up in Alexander's house, in our house, and begin the next chapter of my life. A chapter that my children couldn't script or control or predict. A chapter that belonged entirely to me. 6 months into living with Alexander, I discovered what happiness felt like, when it wasn't borrowed or conditional or dependent on someone else's approval. We'd fallen into rhythms that felt both natural and miraculous. Morning coffee on the terrace overlooking his garden, evening walks through the neighborhood where he'd lived alone for too many years. Quiet dinners where we talked about everything from global politics to what flowers we should plant next spring. I was learning who I was when I wasn't constantly managing other people's emotions, and the woman I found surprised me with her confidence and clarity. Alexander's house had become our house without any formal ceremony or dramatic gestures. I'd simply started referring to it as home, and he'd started asking for my opinion on everything from redecorating the guest room to what charity events we should attend together. My clothes hung next to his in the master bedroom closet, my books filled the empty shelves in his study, and my coffee mug sat next to his in the kitchen cabinet like they'd always belonged together. The silence from my children had been deafening at first, then sporadic and testing, like they were trying different approaches to see which one might bring their controllable mother back. Marcus had tried the financial angle, calling to express concern about my security and suggesting I was making decisions based on emotion rather than logic. Sarah had attempted the psychological approach, wondering aloud whether I was having some kind of delayed midlife crisis and might benefit from therapy to process my recent changes. Emma had gone straight for emotional manipulation, alternating between anger about my abandonment and guilt trips about holidays and family traditions I was supposedly destroying. None of their strategies worked because I was no longer the woman who needed their approval to feel worthwhile. I'd found something better than their grudging acceptance. I'd found someone who celebrated every aspect of who I was and who I was becoming. Alexander didn't just tolerate my quirks and opinions, he delighted in them. When I mentioned wanting to learn Italian, he immediately enrolled us both in classes. When I expressed interest in his foundation work, he invited me to join him on site visits to see the programs in action. When I wondered aloud about traveling somewhere I'd never been, he pulled out maps and started planning adventures. It was during one of these conversations, as we planned a trip to New Zealand that I'd dreamed about for years but never thought possible, that Alexander brought up something that would change everything once again. "There's something I've been wanting to discuss with you," he said as we sat in his study, surrounded by travel guides and printouts of hiking trails. "Something important." I looked up from the photos of Milford Sound I'd been studying, noting the serious expression on his face. "What is it?" "It's about your children," he said carefully. "About the way they've treated you, and about what I think we should do about it." My stomach tightened. We'd talked about my children's behavior in general terms, but Alexander had been respectful of my need to process their rejection at my own pace. He'd never pushed me to cut contact or demanded that I choose between him and them. His patience had been one of the things I loved most about him, but I could see that patience had limits. "What do you mean?" I asked. Alexander set down the guidebook he'd been holding and turned to face me fully. "Lois, I've watched you flourish over these past months. I've seen you become more confident, more decisive, more willing to pursue the things that make you happy. But I've also seen how much their silence hurts you. How you still check your phone hoping for messages that don't come. How you still defend their behavior even when it's indefensible. He was right, and I hated that he was right. Despite everything, despite their cruelty and their attempts to sabotage my happiness, I still loved my children. I still hoped that someday they would see me as I was now, and be proud of the woman I'd become instead of resentful about the woman I'd stopped being. They're my children, I said quietly. I can't just write them off. I'm not asking you to write them off, Alexander replied. I'm asking you to stop accepting unacceptable behavior. I'm asking you to set boundaries that protect what we've built together. What kind of boundaries? Alexander was quiet for a moment, seeming to choose his words carefully. I want to marry you, Lois. I want to make this official, legal, permanent. I want to show the world that you're the most important person in my life and that our relationship isn't some temporary arrangement that can be undermined or dismissed. My heart stopped. Marriage. The word hung in the air between us like a promise and a challenge and a declaration of war all at once. I'd been married before, to a man who'd left when being a husband became inconvenient, who'd treated our vows like suggestions rather than commitments. The idea of trying again, of being vulnerable to that kind of betrayal again, terrified me almost as much as it thrilled me. Alexander, I began, but he held up a hand to stop me. Before you answer, let me tell you the rest, he said. I don't just want to marry you, I want to adopt your children. The words hit me like a physical blow. What? I want to legally adopt Marcus, Sarah, and Emma, he said, his voice steady and sure. I want to give them my name, my protection, my resources. I want to show them that when you marry someone, you don't just marry them, you marry into their family. You become responsible for the people they love, even when those people don't deserve it. I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. They're adults, Alexander. They don't need adopting. That's not the point, he said. The point is making a statement. The point is showing them that I'm not some temporary disruption in their mother's life, that I'm not going anywhere, that they need to find a way to accept our relationship because it's permanent. The audacity of it took my breath away, not just the gesture itself, but the message it would send. Alexander Harrison, billionaire philanthropist, wanting to adopt 3 young adults who had treated him like a predator and their mother like a fool. It was generous and vindictive and brilliant all at once. What if they refuse? I asked. Then they refuse, he said with a shrug. But they'll have to do it publicly, officially. They'll have to explain to their friends and their colleagues, and anyone who asks, why they turned down the offer to be legally connected to one of the wealthiest men in the state. They'll have to own their decision instead of hiding behind concern for your welfare. I could picture their faces when they received such an offer. The shock, the confusion, the desperate scrambling to understand what it meant and what they should do about it. For months, they'd operated under the assumption that Alexander was using me, that our relationship was temporary, that they just needed to wait for it to implode. The offer of adoption would force them to confront the possibility that they'd been wrong about everything. And if they accept? I asked. Alexander smiled, and there was something almost predatory in the expression. Then they become my children, too. Which means they answer to me when they disrespect my wife. Which means they learn what it's like to have a father who won't tolerate cruelty toward the woman he loves. The word wife sent a shiver through me that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with possibility. Wife. Not girlfriend or companion or partner, but wife. The word carried weight and permanence, and the kind of commitment I'd thought was beyond my reach. Is that a yes to the marriage proposal? Alexander asked, clearly reading my expression. Yes, I said, the word coming out stronger than I'd expected. Yes, I want to marry you. He kissed me then, deep and thorough and full of promise, and I felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't even realized was unsettled. Security, maybe, or simply the knowledge that someone wanted me enough to fight for me, to make grand gestures, to take on my complicated family as part of loving me. The wedding planning happened with the kind of efficiency that money and connections could provide. We decided on a small ceremony at Alexander's house in Martha's Vineyard, just close friends and a few family members. I invited my children, of course, though I wasn't sure they would come. Alexander invited his brother from California and a handful of business associates who had become genuine friends over the years. The invitations went out on cream-colored cardstock with elegant script, announcing the marriage of Lois Campbell and Alexander Harrison on a Saturday in late September. I hand-delivered the invitations to my children, partly because I wanted to see their faces when they read them, and partly because I wanted to give them the chance to respond in person rather than hiding behind text messages and voicemails. Marcus was first. I found him at his downtown apartment on a Thursday evening, still wearing his work clothes and looking exhausted from another day of trying to impress bosses who would never see him as anything more than expendable. When he opened the door and saw me standing there, his expression cycled through surprise, wariness, and something that might have been relief. "Mom," he said, stepping aside to let me in, "I wasn't expecting you." "I have something for you," I said, holding out the envelope. He took it with the kind of careful movements people use when they're not sure if they're handling something precious or dangerous. When he read the invitation, his face went completely blank, the kind of studied neutrality he probably used in business meetings when he was trying not to reveal his hand. "You're really doing this," he said finally. "I'm really doing this," I confirmed. "And you're happy?" he asked, and for the first time in months he sounded like my son rather than my critic. "I'm happier than I've been in 20 years, I said honestly. Marcus nodded slowly, still staring at the invitation. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "Several apologies, actually." I waited, not wanting to make it easier for him but willing to listen. "I was wrong about Alexander," he continued. "Not just wrong, but cruel. I was so convinced that no one could want you for the right reasons that I couldn't see what was right in front of me. The admission hung between us like a bridge I wasn't sure I was ready to cross." "Why?" I asked. "Why were you so convinced I wasn't worth loving?" He was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands. "Because Dad left," he said finally. "Because he walked away from you like you were disposable, and I guess I internalized the idea that if your own husband could throw you away, then any man who wanted you must be settling or using you or lying to himself." The honesty in his voice broke something open in my chest. "Marcus," I said softly, "your father leaving wasn't about my worth. It was about his inability to handle responsibility, to grow up, to be the man he promised to be when he married me." "I know that now," he said. "I can see it. In the way Alexander looks at you, the way he talks about you. He's not settling or playing games or going through a phase. He's genuinely, completely in love with you." Tears pricked my eyes. "So you'll come to the wedding?" "I'll come to the wedding," he said. "And Mom? I'm sorry it took me so long to see what I should have seen from the beginning. You deserve to be loved like that." Sarah's reaction was more complicated, layered with the kind of psychological analysis I'd come to expect from her. She read the invitation twice, set it down on her kitchen table, and stared at it like it might spontaneously combust. "This is really happening," she said, more to herself than to me. "This is really happening," I agreed. "And you're sure? You're absolutely certain this is what you want?" The question irritated me more than it probably should have. "Sarah, I'm 53 years old. I've been making my own decisions for over 3 decades. "Yes, I'm sure." She nodded, but I could see the wheels turning in her head, the way she was probably analyzing my body language and tone of voice for signs of doubt or coercion. "I've been thinking a lot about our conversation that night," she said finally. "About the things we said, the way we treated you." And I think we were projecting," she said, slipping into the clinical language that always made me feel like one of her case studies. "I think we were so afraid of losing you, of having to see you as a sexual being with desires and needs beyond motherhood, that we convinced ourselves you were making a mistake." I appreciated the honesty, even if the delivery was typically analytical. "What changed your mind?" "Emma called me last week," Sarah said. "She was crying, really crying, about how empty the house feels without you there. About how she'd been planning to bring some guy home for dinner, and realized she couldn't, because you weren't there to cook it and make everything comfortable and perfect." This revelation didn't surprise me as much as it probably should have. My children had grown accustomed to having me available as both safety net and supporting cast, always ready to provide whatever they needed without asking for anything in return. "She said she'd been taking you for granted," Sarah continued. "That we all had." That we'd gotten so used to you being there, being available, being focused entirely on our needs, that we couldn't imagine you having a life that didn't revolve around us. And how did that make you feel? I asked, unconsciously echoing the kind of therapeutic language she often used. Sarah smiled ruefully. Like maybe I needed to examine my own assumptions about what mothers are supposed to want. Like maybe I'd been confusing love with control. The conversation felt like a breakthrough, like the first honest communication we'd had in months. But I could see that Sarah was still struggling with something, still holding back some concern she wasn't sure how to voice. "What is it?" I asked. "The adoption thing," she said finally. "Marcus told me about Alexander's offer. I just don't understand what he's trying to accomplish." This was the question I'd been expecting, the one that cut to the heart of what Alexander was really proposing. "I think he's trying to show you that this isn't temporary," I said. "That when he marries me, he's taking on my whole life, including the complicated parts." "But we're adults," Sarah protested. "We don't need a father." "Maybe not," I agreed. "But maybe he needs to be one. Maybe this is his way of showing you that he's serious about building a family with me, even if that family includes 3 grown children who haven't exactly welcomed him with open arms." Sarah was quiet for a long time, processing this interpretation. "And what if we say no?" "Then you say no," I said simply. "But you'll have to own that decision. You'll have to admit that you're choosing to remain outside our family rather than finding a way to be part of it." When I left Sarah's apartment, I felt cautiously optimistic about our relationship moving forward. She hadn't apologized as explicitly as Marcus had, but I could see that she was trying to understand, trying to move past her initial resistance, to see what I'd found with Alexander. Emma was the hardest conversation. Partly because she was the youngest and most dramatically affected by the changes in our family dynamic, and partly because she'd been the cruelest in her assessment of my relationship. I found her at the university library, studying for midterms with the kind of intense focus that reminded me of myself at her age. When she saw me approaching her table, her expression immediately became guarded. "Mom," she said quietly, clearly aware that other students were studying nearby. "Can we talk?" I asked. "Somewhere private?" We ended up in a coffee shop off campus, sitting across from each other in a booth that felt like a negotiating table. I slid the invitation across to her without preamble, watching her face as she read it. "You're really marrying him," she said, and there was something almost like wonder in her voice. "I'm really marrying him," I confirmed. Emma set the invitation down and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "I've been a terrible daughter," she said suddenly. The admission was so unexpected, so different from the defensive anger I'd been prepared for, that I didn't know how to respond. "I've been thinking about the things I said to you," she continued, her voice getting smaller. "About how I called you embarrassing and said you were too old to date and told you no one would want you. And I've been thinking about how I felt when I heard those words coming out of my mouth, and I felt sick." Tears were building in her eyes, and I felt my own throat tighten in response. "I don't know why I said those things," she whispered. "I don't know why I was so mean to you when all you were doing was trying to be happy." "Emma," I said gently, "you were scared. You were afraid of losing the mother you'd always known, and you didn't understand that loving Alexander didn't mean loving you any less." "But I should have understood that," she said, wiping her eyes with her sleeve. "I should have been happy for you. I should have been proud that my mom was brave enough to fall in love again instead of making her feel ashamed of it." The conversation continued for over an hour, with Emma apologizing repeatedly, and me trying to help her understand that love wasn't a zero-sum game, that my happiness with Alexander didn't diminish my love for her. By the time we parted, she had agreed to come to the wedding, and had even asked if she could help with any of the planning. The wedding itself was everything I'd dreamed of, and nothing like what I'd expected. The ceremony took place on Alexander's terrace overlooking the ocean, with about 30 guests seated in white chairs, adorned with simple blue ribbons. I wore a dress I'd chosen myself, cream-colored silk that made me feel elegant and confident, rather than like I was trying to be someone I wasn't. All 3 of my children came, dressed in their best clothes and wearing expressions that ranged from genuine happiness to carefully constructed politeness. They'd had months to process the reality of my relationship with Alexander, and while I could see that some adjustments were still ongoing, their presence felt like acceptance, or at least the beginning of it. Alexander looked handsome in his navy suit, but more than that, he looked happy. When I walked down the makeshift aisle between the chairs, his face lit up with the kind of joy that made me feel like the most beautiful woman in the world. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, with vows we'd written ourselves that spoke to second chances and choosing love over fear and building something new without erasing what had come before. When the minister pronounced us husband and wife, the applause was enthusiastic, but all I could hear was the sound of my own heart beating in perfect rhythm with Alexander's as he kissed me. I was married again at 53, to a man who saw me clearly and loved me completely. The reception was held in Alexander's garden, with string lights and a jazz trio, and the kind of food that tasted like celebration. I danced with my new husband, of course, but I also danced with each of my children, conversations without words that felt like forgiveness and new beginnings, and the promise of better relationships ahead. It was during the dancing that Alexander pulled out a manila envelope and handed it to Marcus, who was standing nearby with Sarah and Emma. "I have something for you," he said, his voice carrying clearly enough that several other guests turned to listen. Marcus opened the envelope with shaking hands and pulled out a stack of legal documents. Adoption papers, I realized. Official forms that would make my children legally his children as well. The gesture was bold and public, and exactly the kind of grand statement Alexander excelled at. "You don't have to sign them," Alexander said as my children stared at the papers. "But the offer stands. If you want to be part of this family officially, if you want the legal protections and benefits that come with being my children, then sign them. If not, that's fine too. But either way, your mother and I are married now, and we're a family whether these papers are signed or not." The silence stretched out for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Then Marcus stepped forward, pulled a pen from his jacket pocket, and signed his name with a flourish. "I'd be honored to be your son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Sarah signed next, then Emma, each of them adding their signatures to documents that would change their legal status and, more importantly, their relationship with the man who had married their mother. When they were finished, Alexander gathered all three of them into a hug that looked awkward at first, but gradually became genuine. Watching my husband embrace my children, seeing the way they tentatively hugged him back, I felt something I'd never experienced before: complete family harmony. Not perfect, not without the potential for future conflicts, but real and honest and built on mutual respect rather than obligation. The party continued late into the evening, with guests mingling in the garden and stories being shared about Alexander's business successes and charitable work, and my own quieter but no less meaningful contributions to our community. Several people mentioned how happy I looked, how different I seemed from the last time they'd seen me, how love had clearly agreed with me. Later that night, after the last guest had gone home and the caterers had cleaned up, Alexander and I sat on the terrace where we'd been married just hours before. I was still wearing my wedding dress, though I'd kicked off my shoes and let my hair down from its elaborate updo. Alexander had loosened his tie and rolled up his sleeves, and we looked like exactly what we were: two people who had found each other later in life and decided to make the most of the time they had left. "So," he said, taking my hand and running his thumb over my new wedding ring, "how does it feel to be Mrs. Harrison?" "It feels like coming home," I said, and meant it completely. We talked about the day, about my children's decision to sign the adoption papers, about the future we were going to build together. Alexander had officially announced his retirement the week before, and we were planning to spend the next year traveling to all the places I dreamed about but never thought I'd see. After that, we'd settle into a new routine of foundation work and charitable giving, and the kind of purposeful life that felt like luxury after years of simply surviving. "I have one more surprise for you," Alexander said as we prepared to go inside. "What now?" I asked, laughing. "I don't think I can handle any more surprises today." He pulled out his phone and showed me a text message from Emma. "Mom," it read, "I just wanted you to know that watching you today, seeing how happy you are, made me realize something important. You didn't just find love. You found yourself. And that's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. I'm proud to be your daughter, and I'm proud to be Alexander's daughter too. Thank you for showing me what it looks like to choose happiness." I read the message twice, tears streaming down my face, and realized that this was what victory looked like. Not defeating my children or proving them wrong, but helping them grow into people who could celebrate my happiness instead of fearing it. They'd signed the adoption papers not because they wanted Alexander's money or status, but because they'd finally understood that he wasn't taking me away from them. He was giving me back to myself, and a woman who knew her own worth was a better mother than one who'd forgotten it. 6 months later, I was standing in the kitchen of our Martha's Vineyard house, making coffee and watching Alexander work in the garden through the window. We'd just returned from 3 weeks in Italy, where I'd finally seen the art museums he'd promised to show me, and discovered that I had strong opinions about Renaissance sculpture. We were planning our next trip, maybe to Japan or New Zealand or anywhere else that caught our fancy. My phone rang, and Emma's name appeared on the screen. She called regularly now, not because she needed something or wanted to check up on me, but because she genuinely enjoyed talking to me. Our conversations had become one of the unexpected gifts of this new life. Deeper, more honest, more mutual than they'd ever been when I was just, Mom. "Hi, sweetheart," I answered. "Hi, Mom. Hi, Dad," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. She'd started calling Alexander Dad about a month after the wedding, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. It had taken some adjustment for all of us, but it felt natural now, like it had always been this way. "What's going on?" I asked. "I just wanted to tell you guys something," she said. "I met someone I really like, and when I was telling my roommate about him, I realized something." "What's that?" "I was describing him the way you used to describe Dad. Like he sees me, really sees me, and thinks I'm worth seeing. Like he makes me want to be the best version of myself instead of making me feel like I need to be someone else entirely." My heart swelled with pride and gratitude. Emma had learned something from watching my relationship with Alexander that no amount of parental advice could have taught her. She'd learned what real love looked like, and she wouldn't settle for anything less. "That's wonderful, honey," I said. "I can't wait to meet him. Actually," she said, "I was wondering if I could bring him to dinner next weekend. If you guys don't mind." The request was simple, ordinary, the kind of thing families did all the time. But for us, it represented something revolutionary. My daughter wanting to bring someone important to meet her parents, plural, in our home. Wanting our approval and our blessing and our involvement in her life. "Of course," I said, "we'd love to have you both." After I hung up, I stood in the kitchen for a long moment, looking around at the life I'd built with Alexander. The house was beautiful, yes, but it was also warm and lived in, and full of evidence that two people had made a home together. Our books were mixed together on the shelves. Our photos from various trips covered the refrigerator, and the coffee cups in the sink showed that we'd started our day the way we always did, together. Alexander came in from the garden, dirt under his fingernails and satisfaction on his face. "The roses are going to be spectacular this year," he said, kissing my cheek as he passed me to wash his hands. "Emma's bringing her boyfriend to dinner next weekend," I said. "That's nice," he replied, then stopped and turned to look at me. "That's more than nice, isn't it?" "That's huge." "It's huge," I agreed. He dried his hands and pulled me into his arms, and we stood there in our kitchen, holding each other and marveling at how much our lives had changed. A year ago, I'd been a woman afraid to want anything for myself, convinced that my children's happiness was the only happiness that mattered. Now I was a wife, a partner, a woman who had learned to value her own desires and dreams as much as everyone else's. "No regrets?" Alexander asked, echoing a question he'd asked me on our wedding day. "No regrets," I said, and meant it completely. My children had said I was too old to date, too pathetic to deserve love, too insignificant to matter to a man like Alexander Harrison. They'd been wrong about all of it, but in being wrong, they'd given me the greatest gift imaginable, the motivation to prove that I was worthy of everything I'd dreamed of, and more. I was 54 years old, married to a man who cherished me, mother to 3 children who were learning to see me as a whole person, rather than just a role, and happier than I'd ever imagined possible. The woman my children had mocked was gone, replaced by someone stronger and clearer and completely unafraid of taking up space in her own life. And the best part was that this was just the beginning. Alexander and I had decades ahead of us, years of adventures and growth, and the kind of deep partnership that only comes from choosing each other every single day. My children were building their own lives, their own relationships, their own understanding of what love could look like when it was real and mutual and unashamed. The story my children had tried to write about their pathetic mother and her inappropriate relationship had become something entirely different. A love story, a growth story, a story about what happens when you refuse to accept other people's limitations as your own. It was a story I was proud to be living, and I couldn't wait to see how it ended. 2 years after the wedding, I was standing in the kitchen of our penthouse apartment in Manhattan, preparing dinner for what had become our monthly family gathering. Alexander had surprised me with this apartment 6 months ago, not because we needed another home, but because he wanted us to have a place in the city where the children could visit easily, where we could host holidays and celebrations without anyone having to travel too far. The kitchen was my favorite room in the apartment, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park and enough space for all of us to cook together when the mood struck. Tonight's menu was ambitious: Emma's favorite lasagna, Sarah's requested garlic bread, and Marcus's beloved tiramisu for dessert. I'd learned that food was still the way to my children's hearts, but now it felt like choice rather than obligation, celebration rather than servitude. Alexander was in his study, wrapping up a video call with the board of our foundation. We'd officially launched the Harrison Campbell Education Initiative 18 months ago, focusing on providing scholarships and mentorship programs for first-generation college students. The work was more fulfilling than anything I'd done in my previous career, and seeing our efforts translate into real opportunities for young people made every long day worthwhile. The apartment buzzer announced the first arrival, and I could hear Alexander's footsteps as he went to answer it. Moments later, Emma's voice echoed through the hallway, bright and cheerful and accompanied by a deeper voice I'd grown fond of over the past year. "Mom! Dad! We're here!" she called out, using the family terms that had become second nature to all of us. Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway with David Chen, the graduate student in environmental science she'd been dating for 14 months. David was everything I'd hoped for in a partner for my youngest daughter: intelligent, kind, ambitious in ways that complemented rather than competed with Emma's own goals, and completely smitten with her in the most respectful way possible. "Something smells incredible," David said, giving me the warm hug that had become his standard greeting. "Can I help with anything?" "You can help me open the wine," I replied, gesturing toward the bottles Alexander had selected from our growing collection. "Emma, would you set the table? Your father should be finished with his call any minute." The easy domesticity of the moment struck me, as it often did. A year ago, the idea that Emma would bring her boyfriend to our home, that she would casually refer to Alexander as Dad, that we would all work together to prepare a meal like a real family, would have seemed like an impossible fantasy. Now it was simply Tuesday evening in the Harrison household. Sarah arrived next, alone as she usually was these days. She'd ended her engagement to her longtime boyfriend 6 months ago, realizing that she'd been settling for someone who diminished, rather than celebrated her intelligence and ambition. The breakup had been difficult but ultimately liberating, and I was proud of her for choosing authenticity over convenience. "I brought dessert wine," she announced, holding up a bottle of Moscato. "And news." "Good news, I hope?" I asked, accepting her kiss on the cheek. "The best news," she said, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "I got the promotion. Senior partner, effective January 1st. The kitchen erupted in congratulations and hugs. Sarah had been working toward this promotion for 3 years, building her private practice while maintaining her pro bono work with domestic violence survivors. She'd become exactly the kind of psychologist I'd always known she could be: compassionate, brilliant, and uncompromising in her ethics. Marcus was the last to arrive, and he brought the biggest surprise of all. We heard his key in the door, followed by the sound of multiple voices in the hallway. When he appeared in the kitchen, he was holding hands with a woman I'd met only twice before, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the pediatric oncologist he'd been quietly dating for the past 8 months. "I hope it's okay that I brought Jennifer," he said, though his expression suggested he was fairly confident it would be. "We have something we want to tell everyone." Jennifer stepped forward with the kind of nervous energy that immediately made me suspect what their announcement might be. She was a lovely woman, a few years older than Marcus, with the kind of quiet strength that came from spending her days helping children fight for their lives. More importantly, she made my son laugh in ways I hadn't seen since he was a teenager. "We're engaged," Marcus said simply, and the kitchen exploded into chaos. Emma squealed and immediately demanded to see the ring. Sarah started asking practical questions about wedding plans and timelines. David opened champagne that wasn't supposed to be opened until after dinner. Alexander appeared from his study, drawn by the commotion, and immediately began shaking Marcus's hand and welcoming Jennifer officially into what he called our expanding family. Watching my children celebrate Marcus's engagement, seeing how naturally they included Jennifer in their excitement, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for how far we'd all come. 2 years ago, my announcement of my relationship with Alexander had been met with research and suspicion, and cruel assumptions about my worth. Tonight, Marcus's announcement was met with pure joy and immediate acceptance of his choice. The difference wasn't just in the circumstances, though those certainly mattered. The difference was in who we'd all become as people. My children had learned to see love as something to celebrate rather than fear, relationships as something to support rather than question, and their mother as someone capable of making good decisions about her own life. Dinner was a revelation of laughter and storytelling, and the kind of easy conversation that marks truly comfortable relationships. Jennifer fit seamlessly into our family dynamic, asking thoughtful questions about the foundation's work, and sharing stories from her own career that had us all riveted. Emma and David talked about their plans to spend the summer doing environmental research in Costa Rica. Sarah described her new office and the cases she was most excited to take on. Alexander presided over it all with the kind of quiet satisfaction I'd learned to recognize in him. He'd never had children of his own, had sometimes wondered if he'd missed out on something fundamental by focusing so intensely on his career. Watching him interact with my children, seeing how naturally he'd stepped into the role of father and mentor and friend, I knew he no longer had any regrets about the path his life had taken. "I have an announcement too," Alexander said as we were finishing the tiramisu. "Actually, we have an announcement." All eyes turned to us, and I felt my heart speed up slightly. We'd been discussing this decision for months, but saying it out loud to the children felt like making it official. "Your mother and I have decided to do something that might surprise you," Alexander continued. "We're going to sell the house in Maplewood and the apartment here in Manhattan." The table went silent. These were the homes where we'd built our new life together, where the children had learned to see us as a real family, where so many important conversations and celebrations had taken place. "Why?" Emma asked, her voice small. "Because we want to buy a house in Tuscany," I said, taking over the explanation. "We want to spend half the year there, really immersing ourselves in the culture, learning the language properly, maybe even starting a European branch of the foundation." "It's something your mother has always dreamed of," Alexander added, "and frankly, it's something I never thought I'd want until I met her. She's taught me that adventure doesn't have to end at 50, that there are still discoveries to be made and experiences to be had." "But what about us?" Sarah asked. And there was something in her voice that reminded me of the old dynamics, the assumption that my life should revolve around their convenience. "What about you?" I asked gently but firmly. "You're all adults with your own lives and careers and relationships. You don't need us to live in the same city anymore." "Besides," Alexander said, "we're not disappearing. We'll still spend 6 months a year in the States, still be available for holidays and celebrations and emergencies. We'll just be doing it from a base that makes us both excited to wake up every morning." Marcus was the first to respond, and his reaction surprised me. "That's incredible," he said, raising his wine glass. "I think it's exactly what you should do. You've spent most of your adult life taking care of other people. It's time to take care of yourselves." Emma and Sarah exchanged glances, and I could see them processing what this change would mean for our family dynamic. For the first time since they'd known me, I was making a major life decision based entirely on what Alexander and I wanted, without considering their opinions or convenience or comfort. "Will you be happy?" Emma asked finally, and the question was so simple and direct that it took my breath away. "I think I'll be happier than I've ever been," I said honestly. "Then we support it completely," Sarah said, and I could hear the effort it took for her to mean it. "You deserve to chase your dreams, especially after spending so many years helping us chase ours." The conversation that followed was everything I could have hoped for. My children asked practical questions about our timeline and logistics, but they also asked excited questions about our plans and adventures. Emma wanted to know if she and David could visit us in Italy. Marcus asked if Jennifer and he could honeymoon there. Sarah started researching programs that might allow her to do some consulting work in Europe. By the end of the evening, what could have been a difficult announcement about my choosing adventure over proximity had become a family conversation about how we could all participate in this new chapter of our lives. My children had learned to see my happiness as something that enhanced, rather than threatened, their own well-being. After everyone left, Alexander and I cleaned up the kitchen together in comfortable silence. We'd done this hundreds of times now, this peaceful end-of-evening ritual that still felt like a small miracle to me. 2 years ago, I'd been cleaning up after family gatherings alone, feeling resentful and unappreciated and completely taken for granted. "That went well," Alexander said as he loaded the last of the dishes into the dishwasher. "Better than well," I agreed. I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, for them to revert to their old patterns of trying to control my choices. "They're not going to," he said with quiet confidence. "They've learned something important about love and relationships by watching us together. They've learned that real love supports rather than restricts, celebrates rather than fears." He was right, and I knew it. The change in my children hadn't been sudden or dramatic, but it had been profound and lasting. They'd spent the past 2 years watching Alexander and me build a relationship based on mutual respect and genuine partnership, and it had taught them lessons about love that no amount of lecturing could have provided. Marcus had learned that a good partner challenges you to be better while accepting who you are right now. Sarah had learned that settling for less than you deserve isn't noble, it's just settling. Emma had learned that real love doesn't ask you to make yourself smaller. It encourages you to become everything you're capable of being. 3 weeks later, I was sitting in a cafe in Florence, practicing my Italian with the patient woman at the next table while Alexander met with a local architect about renovating the farmhouse we'd fallen in love with during our house hunting trip. The sun was streaming through ancient windows, the coffee was strong enough to wake the dead, and I felt more myself than I'd ever felt in any of the places I'd called home. My phone buzzed with a message from Emma. "Mom, I know you're busy being fabulous in Italy, but I wanted you to see this." Attached was a photo of her acceptance letter to a PhD program in environmental science at Stanford, one of the most competitive programs in the country. I called her immediately, my excitement bubbling over into rapid Italian before I remembered to switch to English. "Emma, this is incredible! I'm so proud of you! I wouldn't have had the courage to apply if I hadn't watched you take risks and chase dreams," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You taught me that it's never too late to want more for yourself, that choosing adventure isn't selfish, it's necessary." After we hung up, I sat in that sunny cafe and cried happy tears into my espresso. My daughter, my baby, had learned to be brave by watching me be brave. She'd learned to value herself by watching me value myself. She'd learned that women didn't have to choose between being good mothers and being whole people. That evening, Alexander and I walked through the streets of Florence as the sun set behind the Duomo. We'd signed the papers on our farmhouse that afternoon, a 16th-century building with olive groves and a view of the Tuscan hills that made me understand why people wrote poetry about this place. "Any regrets?" Alexander asked, echoing the question that had become our tradition whenever we made a major life change together. "About leaving my children to move to Italy? About selling houses I loved to buy a farmhouse that needs 6 months of renovation? About learning Italian at 55? I pretended to consider the question seriously. "No regrets at all." "Good," he said, pulling me close as we stopped to admire the sunset. "Because I have another confession to make." "What now?" I asked, laughing. I may have already contacted some universities here about guest lecture opportunities, he said sheepishly. And I may have researched programs that would allow us to bring some of our scholarship recipients to study abroad here. This was so typical of Alexander, always thinking 3 steps ahead, always finding ways to combine our personal happiness with meaningful work. You're impossible, I said, kissing him thoroughly right there on the ancient cobblestones. I'm in love, he corrected. With you, with this place, with the life we're building together. 6 months later, I was hosting our first Thanksgiving in the renovated farmhouse. With my entire family gathered around a table Alexander had built himself from wood, salvaged from the original structure. The turkey was American, the wine was local, and the conversation was a mixture of English and Italian that somehow perfectly represented the blended life we'd created. Marcus and Jennifer had been married in our olive grove the month before. A small ceremony that felt like the perfect beginning to their life together. Sarah had started dating a fellow psychologist she'd met at a conference in Rome. Someone who appreciated her intelligence and ambition as much as her compassion. Emma and David were planning their own Italian adventure, a summer research program that would let them study Mediterranean ecosystems while staying in our guest house. As I looked around the table at these people I loved, at the family we'd built through choice rather than obligation, through respect rather than control, I felt a deep sense of completion. Not because my story was over, but because I'd finally learned how to write it myself. My children had said I was too old to date, too insignificant to matter to a man like Alexander Harrison. They'd been spectacularly wrong, but their wrongness had become the catalyst for everything good that had happened since. Their cruelty had forced me to examine my own worth. Their dismissal had pushed me to demand better treatment, and their assumptions had motivated me to prove that I was worthy of extraordinary love. The woman they'd mocked was gone, replaced by someone who knew her own value and refused to accept anything less than she deserved. I was 56 years old, living in a Tuscan farmhouse with a man who adored me, mother to 3 children who had learned to see me as a whole person, and happier than I'd ever dared to imagine possible. And the best part was that this was still just the beginning. Alexander and I had decades ahead of us, years of adventures and growth, and the kind of deep partnership that only gets stronger with time. My children were building their own lives, their own relationships, their own understanding of what love could look like when it was real and mutual and unashamed. The story my children had tried to write about their pathetic mother and her inappropriate relationship had become something entirely different. A love story, a growth story, a story about what happens when you refuse to accept other people's limitations as your own. It was a story I was proud to be living, and I couldn't wait to see how the next chapter would unfold. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.